Faxanadu. Unlock doors of legend on your journey through Faxanadu. And welcome to Nostalgia, a chronological exploration of every NES game released in North America. I'm Mike.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Joe.
Guys, I'm locking it in right there. It's Faxanadu.
No. I see what you're doing. I watched some of those videos too. It's Faxanadu. Like you know, if you go to Europe, you don't have to call it Praha. Like it's Prague. Like it's Faxanadu, Mike.
Here's my 2 cents on this. It seems like the intention is for it to be Faxanadu, but Faxanadu sounds way better. So I'll probably
de facto,
continue calling it Faxanadu.
Yeah, exactly. You can't convert me, Mike.
Well, I exclusively said at the end of last week's episode, Faxanadu, and I don't know why, but that also sounds correct to me. But then, and I think Joe knows about this too, and Sean, I'm not saying you don't know about it, but the argument is that the game that it's like, a spin-off of is called Xanadu, and the Fa is for Famicom. Yeah, so like Faxanadu, but I still don't think that Faxanadu sounds anything like Family Computer Xanadu.
Yeah.
If anything, it would be like Faxanadu, which is pretty close to Faxanadu.
And like once you get into like a portmanteau, like you have to use the grammar and spelling of the word itself. So like, if it's a fax machine, then it's fax, that's just how the letters come together. It's GIF, not GIF.
Yeah, this one was funny because like usually we butch the titles for like a whole nother reason. We've never really butchered the titles because we don't feel like pronouncing it the correct way. Like everybody's kind of agreed that Faxanadu is the way to say it, and we're still like, no, screw it.
I'm saying it's not, but that's neither here nor there.
Well, everybody's going to have a chance throughout this entire episode to take whatever stance they feel like, because I'm sure we're going to say the name of the game more than just now. So I welcome any and all interpretations of Faxanadu.
But that's the wrong. Okay.
That's definitely wrong.
Yeah, careful.
Anyway, so what we're playing this week is I'm going to describe it as a side-scrolling action role-playing game, very similar to a controversial game on the NES known as The Adventures of Link. But without like the top-down overworld. Obviously, there's a lot like other differences, but I feel like if you have the framework of what The Adventure of Link is, and you never played Faxanadu, well, now I think you have a better picture than if I tried to describe other intricacies of this game. There is an overworld in this game, but it's just more of like it remains side-scrolling, and it's kind of like hallways, not necessarily like free jumping between towns or anything like that. Guys, anything
I wouldn't
to
even
add?
say, I wouldn't even say that it's like an overworld. I would just say that it's like it's just connecting rooms. Like the whole, it's all like, it's still like open world in a way, but it's not, there's no overworld.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I guess what I mean is like in a weird way you do backtrack throughout the game. So it's like it doesn't encourage backtracking by any means, but like I guess that's how I view a world map versus like a linear progression. Like this doesn't quite have that linear feel of like you just always go to the next thing and complete the next level.
In the same way that I wouldn't say that Metroid has a world map or an overworld.
Correct. Okay, I agree with that.
And I would say that it even actually like encourages you to use towns as hubs at different times.
Yes.
When you're at this point in the game, you'll keep going back to this particular town. And that's actually something that I feel like doesn't happen as much in an actual like overworld style RPG, because you have a little more freedom to go anywhere. It feels like it actually felt like I had a pretty decent sense of place because of the way these side scroller levels are laid out with like towns intermittently in between them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went back and tested out some Adventure of Link stuff after playing Faxanadu, and I kind of left myself with the opinion that Adventure of Link might have been helped with a more linear side-scrolling progression rather than that top-down overworld map, because they weren't gaining anything by it. Instead, it was like creating interruptions between entering towns and random encounters, whereas in this game, it's like all the fights, all the towns, all of the dungeons all take place in the same style of thing, so they don't feel interrupted. So I thought that was a nice thing.
Yeah, let's take a step back for a second. The game is about a town, or like I guess an ecosystem of an elf like city and a dwarf city and some evil being poisoning the water and making the dwarves evil, and now the water is all dried up for the elves, and like the economy's depressed, and everything's just kind of shit, right? And I thought that because all of the levels sort of have that context, like they're sort of telling that story through the level design of like at certain points, like because there's like a big world tree that sort of connects the whole thing. Like at certain points, you're going through the world tree. The fact that you are seamlessly moving through this location, this place that has context, whether you're in a town at the base of the tree, or you're walking through the tree, or up on the hill where the dwarves are, it all has that sense of place. Whereas with Zelda 2, it's all atomized, and you walk around this secondary mode of play to get to the next side-scrolling area that makes it so that none of these places can really feel like they connect to each other in like even beyond like story-wise. So that is my long-winded way of saying I agree, Mike.
I just want to say that I love the way Faxanadu has made this this world and the way it all connects and everything. I think it's great. I don't think that it's necessarily like this is the good way and Zelda 2 is the bad way. I mean, I'm going to defend Zelda 2, but not just out of spite here. I do think that that like the Zelda 2 does accomplish something. It's just something that's different than what Faxanadu wanted to accomplish, in which you have this freedom to roam, and it feels a little more like Zelda, but then it adds these side-scrolling levels into it. I don't think that it's a negative on Zelda as much as this is just its own positive on Faxanadu for like this unique style.
And if you want to step back even further, the box art and manual for this game, like Sean was doing a great job of explaining the lore and concepts of the story of the game, but even just like the feeling of a grand adventure, right? Like that font for Faxanadu on the box art itself, and the way the manual covers like all the different aspects of the game. I feel like before you even put this game in, it does a great job of selling you of like a grand quest, very similar to the way the original Legend of Zelda did with the shield icon and the script of the Legend of Zelda and the way it presented itself. I saw some parallels there as well. We should talk about the gameplay, but I feel like that's a vague thing to describe, because last week we were talking all about Dragon Warrior, and that's an RPG and has a lot of different moving mechanics too. But this game in many ways has very similar conceits of like experience points that you gain, gold that you collect, towns that you visit, and
gear.
Upgrade your gear and your weapons, or talk to people to get clues on what to do. But it's nothing like Dragon Warrior, and not just because this is what some people might refer to as an action RPG instead of a turn-based RPG, but I feel like there's something else that's different about that. What were your guys' initial takeaways on this style of game? Sean, we'll start with you.
I mean, I'd say that there's a huge difference in quality between these, but it's very much like, I think that Zelda 2, Faxanadu, Castlevania 2, like they're all kind of in the same genre of this weird mesh between standard or like classic RPG and side-scrolling action, and like they all have different game mechanics that like separate themselves from each other, and also, you know, just feelings of quality that separate themselves from each other. But I mean, that's sort of what I would liken it to the most, like this micro genre that's come out of the NES.
Yeah, I'll say it did feel similar to all those, but also in its own way unique. And I don't know if that is just like the feel of it made it feel different, or like the little nuances, like the way you can get these different magic spells that work in this action sense. This one to me felt like really a lot. Somehow it felt a lot like a traditional JRPG, like even though it's not turn-based and it's side-scrolling, which are like the two like most prominent features to a lot of like JRPGs that we've played, you know, that we would have played in this era. This has like the, I don't know, it has like the soul of it in there, and I think a lot of that is just that feeling of exploration, that feeling of gaining whether it's experience or it's new armor, new weapons, and actually getting that like RPG sense to your character.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because, you know, you have to remember this is just a spin-off game in the Dragon Slayer franchise, which is a JRPG franchise, and, you know, this is no different, and so it has familiar tropes and all that. But one thing I thought they handled really well at the, you know, just like the starting impressions of the game is the way that you aren't just like thrown into combat right away. You're thrown into first off the challenge of entering a town. If you don't read that manual, you might be confused on how you even get inside the town. But you just have to press the up button on the D-pad next to doors.
Yeah, that was the first problem I had.
But it's like, so little things like that actually impressed me, even though I was also having a problem with that, Sean. I couldn't understand how I had gotten through, but I just did. But those things are great because last week we were talking about Dragon Warrior just throwing you out there and being like, yeah, if you want to go like explore the entire world, you know, there's not much closed off to you and it's at your own peril, right? Whereas this game says like, hold on a minute, you know, you're going to have to figure out how to do certain things. And so that first town in some ways is a great tutorial for the rest of the game, because I'm thinking about even they won't let you talk to the king unless you have the Ring of the Elf, right? So that's making sure that you're playing the game the way they want you to, that you're going into every house in the town and talking with everybody to gain intel and to just see what will happen with these story beats. Because if you just rush to the king, he won't even see you. But also, that idea of talking to everybody in the town is something that is, you know, important in these kinds of games where they don't communicate story beats through cutscenes or through, a map that you can see, like, oh, you're at this part of the dungeon and you need to go to this part of the dungeon. Like, that doesn't happen in this game. So you have to collect all the intel. And I thought this was like a smart way of setting up, okay, get the ring. Okay, then talk to the king. Now he'll give you your stats and your gold, and then from there go spend at the armory what you need to get through. But also there's keys that you need to buy, and I'm not saying that the keys were a great implementation. I think we could talk about that in a minute, but that's another thing that like they're setting up for you everything that you need to do for the rest of the game, combat aside, in this very first town.
Yeah, and speaking of those, you know, of that need to talk to everyone and get your information that way, I was pretty impressed with this game and its ability to like really give you useful information. I mean, there definitely were translation issues throughout, but there was never that issue of that feeling that they had this character limitation in their text boxes. That I think it was Castlevania 2 that had a couple of them that was like, okay, I guess now that I know what it was trying to tell me, I could somehow distort these words into that meaning, but they're so limited for some reason on the characters that they put in a text box that like I have no idea what it's actually telling me to do, or it's like so cryptic that I would never figure it out. Whereas this was like they were all pretty explanatory, and it made me really feel like it wasn't futile to go into every house that I see and talk to someone, because they might give me some information that either helps me on my next quest or stops me from making a mistake later. And And that's how a game like this is supposed to feel, in my opinion, where you feel like you're living in that world, you're talking to the people, and you're learning stuff. You know, it's that happy medium where you're not getting just cutscenes of text that are just telling you things, but you're also not completely blind and like have no idea where to go.
Just like the very useful tips in Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, such as "I know nothing" and "I am Eric."
Look, if I defend Zelda 2 for this whole episode, I won't talk about Faxanadu. So I won't say it's perfect, but we all know where I stand on Zelda 2.
All right, I'm gonna bring this back here. On the topic of the first town and just like the introduction of this game in general, it brings up something that I will continue to bring up through this game, and that is that it has great presentation. Like, not like you're introduced to this town that apparently, you know, like you're from, or you've been here before, but as you're walking around, you get like the gist of the place from the locals. You get the story of like why everything is shit. Even when you like sort of veer in the wrong direction, like there's already an enemy in the town, and like that kind of like storytelling through the environment I'm always a big fan of, and will always call out. And the fact that like it kind of reminded me of the beginning of Bloodborne, because in the beginning of Bloodborne, you wake up in this room and you start to like move forward, and you think like, okay, now I'm gonna go collect some equipment so that I can actually fight. And before you get any equipment, there's like a giant like werewolf in there, and it guts you. It kills you immediately. I mean, it's possible to beat it, but not on your first playthrough. And sort of walking in the wrong direction and seeing this enemy in the town was sort of that to me, because you don't have a weapon yet before you talk to the king. So you're just this very flimsy character that is going to die immediately. And it even does like, you know, don't fret, don't have bad thoughts. And then you wake up and then you continue on. It really kind of felt like that to me, that first, it had a great first impression with this town.
Yeah, I felt that way as well, with the presentation throughout the whole game. And, you know, just to before we start moving on and talking about everything, I want to really specify for the listeners, for anyone who hasn't played this game throughout, to keep in mind that like every level that we're talking about, like this town that Sean is talking about, is at the base of the tree, of the world tree that he mentioned in his overview. Which this whole game, everywhere we go, takes place on a part of this tree where it's like we're going up this tree. And like, yeah, if you didn't know that, maybe it wouldn't be so obvious, but like knowing that from the beginning and going up the tree and like seeing all the different towns and all the presentation and the storytelling that's done through like the different parts of the tree you're at, and like what has happened to it, and like problems that are going on in it, like that makes this game feel so like well thought out to me. When I have that in mind as I'm playing, where I'm like, there's a cohesive story that they wanted to tell here, and just something about that environmental storytelling of like this whole game taking place on this fantasy element that we don't really see that often, of like this life tree that the whole world seems to exist on, or the whole world that you're playing on, is just a really cool thing to note. And I feel like we'll probably get into this more later, but I don't want to get into all the extra levels without everybody who's listening to like knowing that like this is the context of everything, because I feel like that was really important to my experience of the game.
And Joe, you're right. We don't see it too often, but I think for whatever reason, like a world tree, or like a gigantic tree that like takes care of the land, is a Japanese trope. It is familiar in both like anime and in video games, as recently as Dragon Quest 11 had it, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 had it. Like, so there is some kind of like Japanese folklore behind.
Oh,
like,
sure. And that trope I'm more aware of with like, I think in Final Fantasy 9 that exists too. I'm trying to remember correctly, but I've definitely seen that trope. But I just mean that the setting of this whole game is the tree. So like that's the context for everything. Like you are, the whole game takes place on the tree, unless that's what you're talking about.
No, I think that's great. I think that's a good point to make, the distinction of that this feels more cohesive than even other side-scrolling action games that we've played. But I don't want people to think like, at the end of the day, like the gameplay, as Sean mentioned with Simon's Quest 2, like, Simon's Quest 2 is also a world where it's like Transylvania and you're just going, between towns and stuff like that. Like it's cohesive in that sense of, climbing the tree and scaling the tree, sure, but like each area that you go to is distinct and different. It's not like the same look everywhere you go.
Yes, but it's still like contextualized through this land, kind of.
Yeah, it felt to me like, it's like, oh, okay, you got Middle Earth, and you got these other like fantasy worlds, you got Narnia, you got everything, and this fantasy world is a tree. And I just thought that was cool. Like, that was just interesting. It's not a land. The whole city, the whole whatever, not city, but the whole country or the whole nation or whatever it is a tree. And that was just interesting to me. It sounds really dumb when I say it too many times.
Tree's a funny word.
Also in that first town, you have what I would consider the first like moment of the game for me, where you have to buy the different keys, and originally only the Jack key is available to you, and they just have like, it's just key with a J symbol, and then you get key with a Q symbol later for Queen and stuff like that. You have to buy these keys in order to leave the town. And then you also have to stock up on them in general because you don't know when you're going to need that key of Jack next for a different location. And I don't know, like we've already seen like a lot of implementations of keys in dungeon-based video games handling it a lot better. So I'm not quite sure why they made the decision to have like a key shop where you have to buy and stock up on keys, and that every time you leave a town, like, or an area that requires a key, you have to have that key ready again in order to re-enter those areas. It seems like something that could have easily have been solved, even with NES tech, to just like, once you find this key, whether it's talking to somebody, completing an objective, finding it in a dungeon, once you've found the correct key and can then unlock that door, then, that door stays permanently unlocked. Of course, the problem with that kind of thing is that you run into, that like it's that specific key for that specific thing, and so you're gated from everything else. Having the key of Jack be like specific for some doors, but the key of Queen for others, like having that be the system allows for, I guess, more experimentation and going to areas that maybe you necessarily shouldn't have been, which is great. But I can't help but feel like you could have also then just made the keys that you find incredibly generic, and once you find them, it's your decision which door you want to open with, similar to what Legend of Zelda did with the dungeons, where it's like there's enough keys in there to go through every room, but you also don't need to go into every room of the dungeon to do everything that you need to do in the game.
Well, one thing that I didn't really get about this mechanic is like, it's one thing to have this key seller and have to like sort of go back to the town once you find a door that's locked, and like, okay, I got to get the J key or the K key or whatever the hell. But what I didn't understand is why they're also cheap. Like, you can find the gold necessary to get as many keys as you need pretty easily, so that all it really does is make this like a frustration feature. Like, oh, I have to go back to get the key that costs $100 or 100 golds. Sorry, 100 golds to get a J key, so that now I just have to backtrack to get this. It's either like, it would have made more sense for it to be like you need to have like a certain amount of experience to get through this key, or you find the keys throughout the levels, instead of this kind of almost useless act of buying them, because again, they're so cheap. I don't know what you guys thought about that.
I say, well, so before I jump into that, just the problem that I had with the keys specifically was the fact that the doors don't remain unlocked. That was really annoying, because there is backtracking involved in this game. So I felt like I shouldn't have to buy another key and take up another slot in my inventory to open a door I already opened. As far as the like having to backtrack and like having these keys that aren't that expensive, I think it was in some senses a good, in some senses a bad thing. I think that there were times where that enhanced a little bit the exploration of it, where I ran into a door and like, oh, there's a Q symbol on it. I haven't run into a Q symbol yet. I haven't had access to the queen keys yet. I don't know what that is. And I'm making that, maybe it's not the queen, but with one of the key types this has happened. And then later on, I find a shop that sells these, and I'm like, oh, I wonder what's in that door. Now I can go back and check out that door. And there are other times where it's, it is just like part of my exploration. It's like I came across this door, I can't open it, I'll keep going, and I'll make a mental note. I should pick up a key. It's just that little bit of immersion of like going to the town. I mean, I would have been more frustrated if the keys weren't as cheap as they were. But like I think it's like not a perfect system in general, but it didn't feel like a really negative thing to me, other than the fact that the doors don't remain unlocked. Granted, with that said, where I left off, I got pretty far in the game. I think I'm only like 1 or 2 like stages from the end, and where I sort of stopped, at least for now, is somewhere where I got kind of stuck where I need keys that I don't have and I have to backtrack to get the keys. So I guess that ended up being kind of an annoyance to me. But for the majority of this game, it didn't feel like an annoyance. It just felt like another thing that like makes me feel immersed and like stock up on potions. Like, hey, were there any keys that I remember seeing that I need to grab? Let's grab one of those. Or if I feel comfortable enough not having my inventory full of potions, maybe I'll take a bet that like I'll probably need a J key again at some point. So maybe I'll grab one now.
Yeah, and you're never that far away from where you need to go to get keys. So again, it's not a huge problem, but I did find it to be that kind of annoyance.
And Joe, you reminded me that the inventory system in the game limits the amount of things that you're able to hold, I think, to 7 items. Not counting like your armor and weapons and stuff, but just like in your potions or keys and stuff like that. And that is okay with me. Like I'm fine with, being like, okay, well, you can only have so many life-saving potions that you can buy, again, pretty cheaply, just like the keys. But that, you can't have more than 7 on your adventure through a dungeon, which to be honest is plenty enough, But I still don't think that that's an argument for like the keys being part of that management. Like keys can just be something next to experience and gold in the UI screen. Like I'm not sure that needs to be something that you actively manage in terms of like, oh, gotta go back to town and buy more keys because they keep entering and exiting this dungeon.
Yeah, I mean,
it's an interesting way to do it.
I think that the fact that you have to keep entering and exiting the same dungeon that needs the key, yeah, that is exactly what I think the problem is with it. So it's like, yeah, you got to keep going back. The management thing, like, I don't think it's the best way, but I just think it's a way to do it. I don't think it's like I didn't find it as much of a negative if you were to take out the other negatives.
No, I agree, and we're probably rolling on it a little too long because we haven't even talked about the combat yet, which I guess is the next step if we're following, like, you've been in the town, you've visited the shops, you bought the keys, now you're out in the world of the tree, and you're going to run into enemies, and you're going to have to deal with those enemies with combat, very similar to Adventure of Link with, you have your sword, you have your shield, and you have magic that you can use too. What did you guys think of, don't pretend like you're fully equipped, right, with all the magic you have in the entire game or anything. So like just when you're starting out, right, and all you really have is your sword and the initial, I think it's like a fireball, right?
It's called Deluge, but yeah, it's just a projectile.
Great. Okay. So and you just have that, and that's how you start out this game. How does combat feel like right from the beginning?
It's not crazy bad. It's also kind of sticky in some cases, but and you know what? I think I misrepresented it already. I think it's perfectly fine. The enemies are designed in a way that I think the skill that you will develop when you as you continue to fight these guys is your spacing. Like you're gonna want to make sure that you are a certain distance away from these guys, because whether they're jumping or they're firing projectiles, there's a lot of timing that comes with their patterns and you trying to move forward at the same time and not trying to take damage. That said, you do get a lot of health. I'd say the controls were a little sticky, and there's knockback, which can also be a little frustrating, but that's part of it. I'd say that it definitely feels not like a cookie cutter from any other game, but it's not doing anything too crazy either.
Yeah, I mean it feels like a little bit like a variation of different things that we've seen before. And I did, especially at first, notice a little bit of that stiffness, that clunkiness, and it got me hit and dead quite a bit early on. But I'll say that it is like something that you get used to very quickly, and I feel like by the time I was like an hour or two into this game, I had gotten pretty good at understanding the movement of this game. Because like at first, especially like even just the jumping, if you're in combat, you're trying to jump over something, or even just the platforming is very stiff, and like your attack is stiff, and there's that knockback. But after a while, I got really used to it, and I feel like it felt really good after a while to actually engage in combat in this. And that knockback that you have, the enemies have too, which sounds like a given, but there's so many games that we've had where that just doesn't exist, or it's so minimal. But like I really feel like I'm like warding this enemy back when you hit it once, it gets some knockback, you can kind of gain ground on it. If it hits you, it gains ground on you. Every battle feels a little bit like that, and there are different magic even sometimes affects it differently, not just in like how it hurts them, but how it knocks them back, which like once you start getting different magic and stuff makes it interesting. And it's just, I guess I'm just trying to say it was weird how much of a different opinion I had when I started this game as opposed to even when I was a couple hours into the game as to like how good it felt. Because at first I was kind of like, oh, okay, like this is good, but it's not. It's got some of those problems I've had with it in the past. But after a while, I mean, I played this. I played this actually like pretty straight through in like one long sitting. I played for like 9 hours because I just didn't have a lot of time to play before this. So I played for like 9 hours straight, and like by hour 2, I was like, I am loving this combat system. I was feeling feeling like I had like a flow. Feels like the wrong word because it is sort of stiff, but I just felt like I really had a handle on it, and I think that means that there's something going on in the way that the game moves that's working.
I guess I never really thought about it in the context of, or it never really registered with me that I was inflicting knockback with my attacks as well, because I guess that's why I was sort of describing the combat as more like spacing based, kind of like fencing, even though not all the enemies have like a weapon. Some of them are just like jumping at you, but that is sort of what you're managing throughout the whole game, is just like the distance between you and the enemy at any given time, just to like get that perfect hit in, and then that knockback is sort of your reward. Even though this might be just something that I was feeling, but that's sort of how I was thinking about it.
Yeah, actually, similarly, I hadn't thought of it that way, but as you're saying that, that's exactly how I was feeling. Was like, I can tell where like this enemy is going to end up, and if I do it poorly, he's going to hit me. But if I get myself in the right spot, I'll be able to hit him.
The spacing comment is the one that rings most true for me, Sean, because you saying fencing, I think we said that about Zelda 2 as well. What I really like about the way the game handles the spacing of even just its enemies and you is that you're never really overloaded with enemies, but also the way enemies behave in this game isn't something where like, in Castlevania, there are enemies like those little gremlin characters, that hop like really radically and like all over the place, and they like they're just a nuisance to deal with because the weapons that you have and the way that they move and the size of them on the screen, it doesn't like correlate to a fun experience. It's more like I hate when that enemy shows up. There's really no character in the enemy in this game that feels like that, where you're like, oh, I can't believe I'm dealing with these guys. Like they've included some annoying characters like those bumblebees and stuff like that, but they're never cheap. And the amount of characters on screen and the amount of like space in a in a particular like screen that you're on with the amount of enemies they provide with you makes it a fun challenge of like, how am I going to deal with the platforming and the way that the enemies are laid out? Because you could be dealing with like two different enemies, right? But because it's never on like flat ground, right? There's always like either ladders that you can climb or, different platforms to jump onto. There's like a way to think about how to take on the enemies on screen. And yeah, they'll regenerate if you go back to the next screen, which is good for, farming experience or collecting gold. There's never, no two screens are the same either. So you're always running into a different way of dealing with encounters. So combat never gets stale in that sense. The only time combat gets stale is if you were up to the task of grinding, which I don't think the game necessarily forces on you, but you can get stuff earlier by doing it as such. But I really just appreciate the types of enemies that they gave you while increasing the challenge as the game went on too, but never giving you anything that felt cheap or unfair. The one thing, and I think this is a me thing, because I've said this with multiple games, is I still had problems with like the hitbox detection, where like sometimes my sword would just be like, I feel like I would poke it at their nose, like it wasn't enough to do any critical damage, but I was like, I'm just right there, and it's like, I'm not.
I never had it with me inflicting damage, or maybe I didn't, I just wasn't really noticing. I had it more when I was trying to avoid damage, like jumping over enemies. I'm like, I definitely cleared that guy. But like when you're jumping over someone and you get hit, you kind of get teleported back to the ground and you just have to live with yourself. It's like, that is very punishing. Just that feeling of getting slammed back down to earth. Because in a lot of games, like if you're jumping, you take damage, like it gives you feedback. You either flash or your jump gets disturbed in some way, or like it's not the same arc. But like when you get hit, when you just like clip the guy's hitbox by a pixel and you get slammed back down, it's just like, oh my god. So yeah, it wasn't offensive for me. It was more that defensive big hitbox.
And another interesting thing about that knockback mechanic is, we've seen that in other games where if you get hit by an enemy on a platforming like stage and then you get knocked by the enemy so bad that you fall into the pit and die, that's a NES gamer's worst nightmare because it happens so often. In this game, yes, you can fall into like holes that knock you down to a lower part of the dungeon, right? Or the town that you're exploring, not town, but like the overworld area that you're exploring to get to the next town. Like that can happen, but there are no actual pits in this game. So it's never a major consequence, but it is, there is some punishment involved with what's happening if you happen to fall through these things. Now, granted, they've also turned that into puzzles sometimes where you want to fall through a pit to get to an area that you couldn't have got to otherwise. But I think that's an interesting trade-off for knockback, right? Is like it adds an element of feeling to being hit, but it also like does something in progression wise that we haven't seen with most games, in that there is no game over or fall damage taken. It's just, a progression setback.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's a lot easier to deal with than, and a lot less frustrating than a one-hit death.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that if this game did have those, like, I don't know, stage hazards or like pits or even like spikes or something like that, and you kept getting knocked back, like if there was this amount of knockback into those kinds of things, that would be a frustrating and sort of unfair feeling experience. But because of the layout of these games, I think that the knockback doesn't give you those problems.
This is sort of like a forgiving game in general. Like it never, like you're given a lot of health, a lot of mana. You can't fall down a hole. You're only really ever losing a little bit of progress at a time. Did you guys feel the same way? Is this an easier game?
I think so, because it also, you have to remember, when you die, you just go back to wherever you last saved with the meditation stuff. Those guys, the gurus, and the potions restore you back to full health. So like, there's a lot of forgiveness, but I think it helps in these earlier NES games where they're trying to tell bigger stories, right? This isn't the same thing as, level 1, level 2, and like seeing how far you can go before you die, right? It's a totally different kind of game. And so I kind of appreciate it, just like how we appreciated Dragon Warrior, being able to just save by talking to the king, and like if you die, it's not like, well, when did you last save? Because that's where you're going back to, like you just lost some gold. I feel like that's the appropriate level of punishment in these older games. The whole like reset back to the beginning of a game, or even like back to where you last saved. Well, maybe not where you last saved, but definitely when it's game over. I'm going to view those games a little harsher now that we have had games that have been a little more forgiving, because as history shows, forgiveness in, skill level is something that is appreciated by almost all video games now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that this game being easier, and for the record, I don't think this game is easy. I think it's just easier than a lot of games. And I think that makes it like much more accessible than some games where it's like, I don't have to get really good at this one specific really Nintendo hard game. And maybe that's just like the 90s kid who didn't grow up with these games in me. But like this felt much more accessible than a lot of other games we've played that were right out of the bat a lot harder and a lot less forgiving. But like I don't think this game is like, oh, here's everyone's happy and here's a really easy like walk in the park for you. But it was like not like, okay, you have to practice. You have to actually practice this game before you can really start going anywhere in it, which I feel like a lot of other games have been. I'll even say that I do think that this is, because I think like the combat is a little easier than combat in Zelda 2, that I think that I could see the argument that this is a little more accessible than Essential Game Zelda 2.
Well, if you remember Zelda 2, though, there was like two different types of combat. There was the random encounters and they weren't random, you walked into them, but they like spawned randomly, encounters in the overworld. And then there was the dungeon style combat. Now, this whole game takes the dungeon style combat where everything is also like involved in progression and the layout of the particular dungeon you're in, which is arguably the best part of Zelda 2, because when you're running into the more random encounters just to grind up for experience and such, they just put like either it's completely flat land, or they put like, some blocks to add a place to have to jump over, or for enemies to be unable to reach you. They just place those things throughout depending on the location you're in, and it doesn't feel as purposeful. Whereas this whole game, like every screen does feel like they at least thought, oh, well, we should put an enemy here, because just even based on the simple coding we did, where enemies always just, they're like heat-seeking missiles. They have to go towards the direction that you're in. Not even if it makes sense for them, but just that's how they behave. They at least placed enemies in ways that made sense then, based on like which screen you might enter in first or such. So I do think even if the combat is easier, because you have, it's more forgiving in terms of amounts of hits you can take and the amount of enemies that they put on a screen, it's still thought about. Like it's not just like, oh, it's easy because there's only this one or two enemies on every single screen. It's just more thought out, and more like the whole idea of the game is just to continue building experience, getting new armor, new weapons, new magic, and furthering this quest that you're on to take down the evil one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this whole game feels like like you're getting stronger as a warrior and taking out these monsters. So it takes a lot to kill you after a while, after you get good at this game. And, some enemies do way more damage than others. Some are like actually devastating if you get hit. But for the most part, like it feels like you're this warrior, and like what's going to kill you is being out in this dangerous area for too long, or getting hit by too many enemies over time. And whereas Zelda 2 felt a little more like, sometimes I would, even in those side-scrolling dungeon levels, I would get into like, I would find an enemy, and it would be like each encounter I kind of got into felt a little like a one-on-one duel. Like, this guy is almost as powerful as me, and like I have to really think about like, how am I gonna get past his shield before he gets past my shield, and or something like that. Like I have to jump and like avoid him more as if he's like a one-on-one enemy, which I think they're both interesting ways to go about it in their own right, but like they just make the games feel different.
we were giving our impressions of the combat system, and I think we went pretty in depth. But just to continue that conversation with the magic system and the progression of combat in general, like, you know, you're given access to pretty much everything that you will do in the game at the start of the game, but then it evolves in terms of the magic you have, the weapons you have, the armors that you have, and stuff like that. Does the combat actually feel? We mentioned that you're feeling stronger, sure, but does the combat actually feel like it changes based on the magic system and what you learn throughout the game?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that one, because of the enemy variety. I mean, like I said, I'm many hours into this game, and I'm still getting introduced to new enemies that do new things, which changes things up. And then also, like, yeah, the weapons are like usually just like a longer version of your last weapon that does more damage for the most part. But like, that does make you think about things differently. Like you get weapons that can hurt enemies that you couldn't hurt with a previous weapon at all. And the magic, some of the magic affects things in different ways. I mean, not a ton of magic variety, but I know there's one spell that like knocks things to the back of the screen and is good for like crowd control or like giving yourself a second. And it actually became very useful. And apparently that's an optional spell. Or like an optional spell to even find it.
I think they all are kind of.
I guess they're all optional, but like I think the fire spell I'm talking about is not like you don't find it in a town. It's like a side area.
Yeah.
Where there's a hidden, not hidden, but like a missable
old
shop
dude with a beard.
Yeah. So for that element, like I do think that I felt like it was evolving. It never got like crazy different than the beginning, but it felt like it was always the next step in the progression of the combat.
And even little things like, and it's like it's pretty early when you get the small shield, but when I was playing it without the shield, like everything hurt a lot. And then once you get the shield, you can kind of, tank a little bit. You can sacrifice a hit or two just to make the rest of the combat a little more fluid. Like it's just tiny things like that it does make combat a bit more dynamic over the course of the game as you're leveling up.
Yeah, and I think even the magic system in this game, it's weird to compare it to Dragon Warrior, but we were kind of dunking on that because it didn't offer like a full experience of what we expect with an RPG, and even just the names of the magic wasn't really satisfying enough. But in this game, you don't like get like a ton of different magic, but because it happens, in this side-scrolling action format, the magic does feel different enough that, whether you're doing the thunder projectile or the death projectile or whatever, like, it feels like you are advancing your magic ability, even if the only thing that's changing is the damage of said projectile, right? Like, it's not like there's a cool animation or anything that changes.
Sure there is. Right?
Say that again?
There's a different animation for each spell.
Oh, well, yeah,
yes.
The sprite looks different, but I guess what I meant is, like, you don't cast fire, and then there's, like, this epic, like, enemy gets set on fire thing.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like, the magic is still just another, like, different-looking projectile that basically does the same thing, but attributes more damage points to the enemy.
And I guess that's also just a symptom of, like, this is a game where you are one-to-one interacting with the environment, whereas Dragon Warrior is just, you decide to cast it, and it happens, and then you continue on. I guess I don't know if I'm saying that clearly enough, but since you're on the ground with your character instead of choosing from a menu something to do and then moving on, it feels a little bit more satisfying to do.
Yeah, and then they even make, like, the items that you can just, like, buy readily, like the wing boots or the hourglass or I think it's the mattock, the little pickaxe.
Yeah.
These items that you have, those almost feel like they could have been spells that just have different uses than attacking enemies. Like, it's kind of interesting that they left magic to just be what I think of as Final Fantasy black magic stuff that like just does damage to characters rather than having any form of, white magic where it's like things that affect the environment. Now, granted, they do have those things in the form of items, but I don't know, why can't you have like a fly spell or a time spell where you stop?
Like a TM?
Yeah.
I was surprised that there wasn't even like a heal spell. I was like, at some point, I knew from the beginning of the game, at some point I'll get a heal spell, but no, there was no heal spell, which is fine. It's just not, I think it subverted my expectations.
There's enough bread loaves. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. In some areas.
Yeah, and then, there's enough red potions, I suppose, that, like, you don't need to have that spell. I guess I was just surprised that they only thought of magic as a combat-based thing and not as, like, a puzzle-solving mechanic throughout the dungeons. That might have been interesting to, lock something behind a certain magic that you need.
Well, I guess in a way, and I know it is still an item, but, like, the magic boots, like, one of the first things that you have to do is to use the magic boots to fly up and sort of like start the fountain setting quest, which I thought was pretty cool. And like, it is an item, but at least it's not just like, oh, I killed this boss that was protecting the fountain. It was actually something that you had to do not quite outside the box, but it was a more unique interaction with the game to move forward. So whether it's through magic or an item, it's still, I think, a more interesting way to go about it than just straight up like combat through everything.
So forget about the enemies that you run into as you're exploring from town to town or going inside these dungeons. What is the exploration mechanic of this game like? Are there forks in the road here? Are there interesting paths that you can take? Or is it more just like a series of hallways that, that we see now as like loading screens in games, but like mostly just point A to point B to get to your next dungeon beat? Which path do you guys feel like Faxanadu took?
It seems like it starts out kind of open and then it narrows. But that also could have just been my...
Sure, I think that's what we're interested in, right? Is like, there's one way of looking at it, right, where you could just like pull up the strategy guide and look at the maps and decide for yourself, right? But I think it's important to think about what your gameplay experience was like too, because you might have just continued to be like, well, the dungeons are the progression in the game, and for me, exploration is just based on, moving along story-wise, so I don't need to like explore every nook and cranny of everything. I just want to get to the next dungeon, if you will.
And I think that this may just be like just rationalizing, but it almost makes sense in the context of the game where like you're at the base of a tree, it's a bit more spread out, you're going up a tree, there's going to be some branches, and then like once you're at like the top of the tree, like you can't really explore anymore. You're just like at this little precipice. So I don't know. That's one way to look at it.
I thought that it was kind of it was linear in the sense that there are 8 towns, and you have to hit them in a certain order as you go. You're going to hit them along your way, and there's definitely like a linear path to the end. But I found there were a lot of like branching path, no pun intended, branching paths that like would take you to different areas. Maybe a lot is the wrong word, but more than I expected from a side scroller game like this that felt like oh, it could only really be linear. But you have that, it was the Forepaw, or one of the first towns you go to where you have to do that fountain mission where there's these 3 fountains, and they're sort of scattered in different directions, and those are all things you have to do. It's kind of like a little detour. Before you move on, you have to explore this whole area of the tree, these different branches of the tree. Then later on, there's when you're in like the mist area, that you have like, you can get lost a little bit, but also like there are totally optional towers. I think in a couple of the areas between a few of the different like in between areas between 2 towns, there are totally optional paths you can go on that'll take you to totally optional dungeons or towers or whatever you want to call them. Which I did one of them and got like some good items and like it felt like there was a reason to go to it, and I felt like each section had like a little bit of that. Like, all right, to move on, I can go this way, and to, I could also explore this way and maybe find something good, or maybe there's something interesting over here, or like I said, there's a hidden house over here that sells a spell I can't get anywhere else in the game. And I sort of balanced the like desire to just explore and see if I'm going the right direction or see what I find, with also sometimes being like, okay, I want to go the right way. Sometimes I would look at a guide if I was lost. But I did find more than I was expecting, I guess, of that like branching path stuff.
Yeah, I guess I'd describe it more as like a hub and spoke. Like each town like has some places that you can go to, but you're never really going to veer that far away, and then you get back to the main path eventually. It's a lot less like insulting than a lot of more modern like Final Fantasies, where it is just sort of like a hallway simulator. It actually has you have some latitude with how you can move, but you're always sort of going to find your way back to the main
and Joe,
drag.
you were talking about how, some optional towers and stuff like that, or even that you don't necessarily have to experience everything. And I thought that was a great implementation of even in the dungeons. Like, there are so many rooms in the dungeons. It reminded me almost of, the original Legend of Zelda there, where, you can, if you know the path to the boss, there are ways to get there significantly faster than maybe the most frequently traveled path. But with the dungeons, in a game like this, you might think they just set it up so that, you just have to, you go into this screen and then there's a ladder and you go up that ladder and now you're on the next screen and then you got to go to the left because the right's blocked off. That doesn't happen. Instead, there's a lot of different paths you can go on. And yeah, like some of them are just going to take you into, not dead ends necessarily, but longer paths or more enemies or something like that. But that actually incentivizes for me a reason to play without a map, because you might still get to the end, but it's just the path you choose of getting there. I thought that was kind of an inspired choice to have a way to deal with the dungeons, have different experiences in the dungeons, but not necessarily change like the objective or make the objective puzzle-like in any particular way. It just makes it so that the route that, you and I get there might be a little bit different.
Yeah, and you might discover other things on a different route too, which I found interesting. I do want to also say, though, in fairness, that there were two times where there were branching paths that I felt like would have made a little bit more of a negative experience. So one was actually a dungeon I was spending a lot of time in. I wasn't sure. I hadn't looked at a guide. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be there. I assumed it was where I was supposed to be. Finally, I was at those bosses, those winged bosses that shoot fireballs.
Yeah.
Are like the worst thing. I was fighting one of them and I couldn't beat it, and I decided to look up a guide to make sure I was going the right direction. And when the first sentence in this section of the guide was like, "This tower is entirely optional." So first I was like, okay, great. But it said like at the end of the tower, there's a reward of like this, I don't know if it was a glove or it was something that you get it and it permanently increases your power. And I was like, okay, well that's definitely worth it. So I'm glad I put all this time in. Right below that in the guide, it says, however, there's a bug in the game where at the start of the game, it thinks you already have this. So when you get it, it just takes it away.
Whoa. Really?
You're talking about the pendant.
Yeah, the pendant. It was like, go ahead and continue on if you want to give yourself more of a challenge for the rest of the game. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to leave this tower. There's also another optional tower later on that's literally called the Useless Tower, which I didn't go into. But so like, maybe, there could have been some learnings for that. The first one is a bug problem, so if they fix the bug, it actually would have been
So two
cool.
thoughts on that. So Joe, first thing, the useless tower, right? Can anything truly be useless in this game when there's a chance to earn experience points and level up? Of course, I would not even agree with that, because I don't think that's true of anything where it's like, oh, well, you've been given the gift of grinding. Like, I don't,
Yeah.
I don't agree with that. But then the second thought, I'm surprised you brought up the pendant, because I had like a whole tangent that I was going to save for later on about that. But the pendant for me, and it is true, it basically, instead of making you
So the whole game you're overpowered.
Right. Instead of making you overpowered, you actually get halved in power. So it's actually like a challenge mode thing, but it's a bugging error. It was not like a trick. They weren't intending to do that. It's definitely a bugging error. And that makes me just think about, like, there is such a case today, especially for those of you who are listening and replaying these games. Yes, there is some satisfaction in, like, playing the game exactly as it was intended on NES hardware with the original cartridge and everything like that. But I also think now is a better time than ever to look at the ROM hacking scene and really, like, see what improvement hacks they have. I'm not talking about people who, like, they make like Faxanadu 2 and they create their own crazy levels and stuff like that. Like that, you know,
but just a version of the game where you start with like normal strength and then the pendant does the correct thing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right, exactly. And that exists. You know, and there are plenty of hacks like that for all different kinds of games. There are hacks even for Final Fantasy 1 and Dragon Warrior, where they actually just change the amount of experience points that things give. So they're not just like as easy as saying everything's doubled, but like thinking about, well, you know, these enemies are a little tougher, so they should give more experience points than they are giving. And
I can't. This is almost an unforgivable thing that they just like let leave in the game. That like we're talking about how like forgiving the game is and how easy it is in some ways, and to think that this is not the balance that they were going for is insane.
Right, and also I think that, like, because we were saying pretty positive things about like the challenge level of this game, and I think that they maybe accidentally
improved the game.
Yeah, like I think the bug actually sort of improved the game. I mean, I don't know how much of a difference it makes having this thing to not, because I feel like still doesn't feel like I do a ton of damage in this game. I mean, so some of these enemies, depending on which weapon you have, still take like 7 hits a little later in the game to just kill one regular enemy. So like, yeah, maybe they were intending it to be a little more Nintendo hard, and they accidentally made it a little more accessible.
Yeah, that's insane.
Which is crazy. I mean, I don't know what it says about their design for this game, but the final product worked out.
I think it's also because the pendant is optional, right? If it was something where like you need this to go to the final castle, right? Then it's like, okay, it's a little more strange, right? Because then it's almost like, how did they not play test it? Yeah, exactly. But it's also weird in a game with, we're not pretending like there's optional towers galore, right? There was only like 3 or 4 optional side quests in the whole game, and so to not test those things either, it feels a little strange, obviously. But again, that's just my case for people a reason to check out ROM hacks on top of your traditional playing. We know some of these games are like, just cozy to play the way that they were originally made and stuff like that. But I also think there is a case to, to find balance in modern game design being reapplied to these older games that, not necessarily the designers were thinking about at the time.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's just quality of life stuff. I mean, I will say I was very annoyed every time I wanted to buy 5 potions, and I had to reopen the shop menu for each potion, and like goes with the whole conversation for each potion. I can't just say I'd like 5 potions.
Yeah, that's true. It was Charles Barkley Shut Up and Jam the original a ROM hack, or was that never an actual game?
Yeah, it's an actual game, but probably made with RPG Maker.
Okay.
I should look into that, but I definitely know it was made with some kind of RPG-like engine maker. I don't know if it was specifically. I know you owned a copy of RPG Maker on PlayStation. I don't think they used that one.
Yeah. Okay.
We talked briefly about those gurus who do they create the meditations for the save passwords, but I mean, like, maybe it was supposed to be this way, but it is kind of funny that they're like, sit down here and meditate with me, and then they just say like the most, Yeah, exactly. Like just a pile of letter vomit on you that, like, I guess if you wanted to try it, you could be like, it's blah, blah, blah,
There's
like
some numbers
you could
in there,
try
though,
and say like, oh, that's how he's saying it, right? But more than likely, he's just saying ridiculous letters that correspond to passwords that mean something very specific for the exact loadout that you have based on experience points, gold, armor, progress that you've made.
I don't really have a problem with it. I mean, it's just a way to build the passwords into the lore of the game.
No, absolutely. I'm saying I think it's actually kind of neat, right? It's like they're coming up with their own language.
But
there,
when I was looking up on like some background in this game, like everyone apparently hates it and like just makes fun of it at all times. So
I was surprised because I also think that like, is this the first time we've seen them try to like contextualize a password in the world? Like, it feels like it really just never wants to take you out of the world.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the only other time that I can think of, like, no, that wasn't even passwords. It was like a save feature. So yeah, I don't know. I think this might be the only time we've seen this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just a couple weeks ago with Dragon Warrior Quest.
Well, no, because they would save your, you would take a rest and they would save your file. So I think this is the first time we're seeing passwords.
Well, passwords specifically, but at least the save file, and that was like, oh, if you want, go to the king and he'll write down your.
Oh yeah,
he'll write down your in the journal
right.
or whatever.
He's taking an audit of your of
your
time in this fire. So, like, one other thing that about this game that I just wanted to mention is going back to what I said at the beginning about the presentation. Like this game, between its like very restrained like color palette and very detailed backgrounds, and it's just a very pretty game. Like, especially like the mist levels. Like, I didn't even think that the NES could do like the kind of effects it was doing. But regardless of if it's like just that mist, or just the details of the wood when you're in the tree, or just the darkness of the palette and like the enemy design, like it all like really feels like the same thing. Whereas I think a lot of games, RPGs included, just sort of feels like this mishmash of assets that get thrown together. Like, I think that the holisticness of the style in this game is worth mentioning.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of times I notice when a game is really bright and colorful, like maybe like the original Legend of Zelda or Zelda 2 or whatever, like they look cleaner. And then when they're trying to make it look a little darker, I don't want to say gritty, but they try and make it look a little more earthy, and they try to make it look a little more like, have that little more like realism to the color palette. That, like, on the NES would always get a little messier. And I was impressed that they kind of married both of those. And like, this is like, there are a lot of times where things are dimmer, things are a little darker, and it still feels very clean. Granted, there were a couple times where I couldn't see a door that was right by my face because it like blended in with the background. But those times were few and far between compared to how nice it felt. And it also just, I really want to just hit home how each area feels, one, like its own area, and two, like a very natural part of this world that they made based on the visuals. So there's the I think it's right out of the town of like Forepaw, or one of the third town is where you have to do those side quests we talk about, where you got to find these fountains, and that's just like this one town that's relying on these fountains, and you're helping them. It's a nice chunk of the game where you feel like, I'm in this area, like, I'm in this land right now, this part of the tree where these people live and they need this, and I'm doing this whole quest going all over, this area. And then later on, I think it's the town of Victim. Everything has this like mist.
What a great town.
Yeah, a Victim. Some of these names of the towns. But the town of Victim, everything has this like mist overlaid over it, and everything feels very eerie, and it has this very. I'm a sucker for like well done tones in retro games, and this has this very eerie tone, and it ties into the story that like this is where the meteor hit, and the tree in this area is burning, so there's all this mist and smoke that's kind of around, and it feels very haunted and creepy, and every area kind of feels like its own area, and it really does a good job of setting a mood.
And
for
the
each area
characters
and for the
too.
game as a
Like
whole.
a lot of them just look fucking miserable. Like when you walk into a bar in any of the towns, like because the towns, aside from a couple examples that Joe pointed out, like that they all kind of look similar, just sort of a different orientation of the buildings. But when you're in these towns, like all the people, like you could tell that the world that they're in isn't great. Like there's even some smoking characters that I don't know if like they just missed that or if Nintendo was just cool with it. Like I don't know. But it's
the
not,
one smoking.
Yeah,
The one smoking shopkeep is Bill Murray. I swear. Yeah. Is it not? It looks just like Bill Murray to me.
They're also like indifferent to the quest in a lot of ways. Like I don't know if you guys thought that the dialogue just kind of seemed to not be like, you know, sometimes in video games when you do stuff, people are like amazed or they're like so thankful to have you. And it doesn't really seem like anyone's like that impressed by you or the shit you're doing, or like, you know, even the king, you know, early on is just kind of like, you know, you could do this. Like it's could. Like I'd be like,
so
don't
this
we
is
need
fantasy
to do
New
this?
York.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting approach, right? Of like some people are in this game are like more resigned to their fate than the hero is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a little bit of hopelessness, and everyone's rapidly blinking the tears out of their eyes because we got to talk about how every character is blinking really, really fast.
It is weird.
It's a nice animation, but it's
disconcerting,
unsettling. Yeah.
On the sequels and spin-off side, obviously, as I mentioned early on in this podcast, Xanadu did come first. It's on MSX and computers, not on the Famicom. It's a more basic version of this game. I think if you're a fan of Faxanadu or Faxanadu, you can only be a fan of one of them. But if you're a fan of either Faxanadu or Faxanadu, I think it'd be hard to go back to Xanadu. Maybe that has, I'm not talking about like graphically, right? Like it is worse looking, but like I just feel that this game used all the power of the NES to make it overall like better experience than what I saw. I didn't play it, but from what I saw on YouTube, it just seemed to be a very clunky first attempt at a Dragon Slayer spin-off style game that this action role-playing game is. But if you want more Xanadu after Faxanadu, there are two other Xanadu games. There is Xanadu Next, which came out on the N-Gage in 2005.
Wow.
Now, should we just talk about the N-Gage for a second, or is that like a whole nother show?
I mean, I just remember, you know, I forgot what channel I was watching. Maybe it was during the commercials for like I was watching Lost, just seeing like vertically oriented gameplay of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and then
I was just about to say that's the only game I know on the N-Gage is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater.
I think there also was like a shitty version of like that cover shooter that I can't remember the name of, but yeah, there's a very specific. That was just a specific thought key that opened up memories in my head.
It did finally come out for PCs, though, too, so you didn't have to just own the obscure cell phone / video game console N-Gage. You could have played it on PC, and you still can if you want to. It's a 3D version of most of Faxanadu's concepts, but to me it doesn't like feel or look similar. It just looks like it's following like whatever the trends of JRPGs were at the time. It definitely doesn't have the tree concept, but it also just doesn't have a lot of like what I would, I guess, consider like staples of this game involved in it. It's just more like, yeah, we see what Final Fantasy and Tales of and those games are doing, and we're just gonna continue to follow that line of video games rather than iterate on Faxanadu.
I just pulled it up and it looks disgusting.
Yeah, it's a little strange just to even have these, you know, names linked up, right? Because I don't think like the Xanadu brand is a strong one by any means. But wait till, Sean, if you were looking up Xanadu Next, you should definitely look up Tokyo Xanadu, which is the Xanadu Next gameplay, but with Persona like elements of people, like teenagers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's just bizarre that they did this, but it's available on PS Vita and PS4. I like Persona and I like Faxanadu, so I want to play the two merged together. I don't know if you will feel like they are merged or if you'll just feel like you bought a discount version of Persona. But this whole thing is a spin-off of the Dragon Slayer series, and for those of you who are like, what's the Dragon Slayer series? You may remember, and I don't even know if Sean and Joe remember, but we've played Dragon Slayer 4, which Xanadu is Dragon Slayer 2, I think, or a spin-off of it. It's not even an official title. But Dragon Slayer 4 for us was known as Legacy of the Wizard. That's the one where you play as the whole family traversing a very complex underground cave. So in this game you climb up a tree, but in that game you go down a cave. But I guess that's the similarities between them.
Well, this does it better.
Yeah, that game also had a ton of backtracking, though, to the point where that was, we couldn't get over it at just how much you have to continuously backtrack in that game. We are going to not backtrack, but look forward to the next segment of this show, the segment of the show that we do every episode of Nostalgia, and that is the Essential Games List. Sean?
I want to make this clear that I don't just have a vendetta against Zelda 2. And I also am not saying this to get a rise out of Joe. But I did have more fun in this game than I did in Zelda 2. And I know that they're not carbon copies of each other and one is just better than the other. They're very different games. But the fact remains that this game between it, not the fact remains. The opinion remains that this game, between the presentational, the stylistic things that this game does well, it's just a prettier to look at game for me. The coherence of its plot, while it's still simple, the fact that it's all happening in this sort of well realized world, it's got its flaws. I still think the combat's a little sticky, but then I kind of think that about all the games in this micro genre. I think that the experience was good enough for me, and this was a surprising enough experience that I would put this on the Essential Games list.
So is that a yes?
I would,
but he's not.
It's
okay.
Yeah, it's a yes.
It's a yes. There we go. So Sean has put it on. It is now time for Joe to vote.
Well, I think it's actually a little ironic because a couple weeks ago we played Dragon Quest. That was one of the first games that was really about. I was like, yes, this is about to scratch that itch that I've been waiting for. I mean, we've had other ones yet, but this is what I've been waiting for, is this JRPG style, and it did. It was good. It wasn't great. It had its problems. It was clearly okay, this is still very early in the JRPG thing. Enter Faxanadu, which doesn't do any of the things that I was attributing to that feeling that I wanted. It's not an overworld open, you go in any direction. It's not a turn-based RPG where you have time to think about your strategy and stuff like that. But somehow it scratches that itch more than Dragon Warrior does. I'm just going to keep bouncing back and forth between Dragon Quest and Dragon Warrior. And I feel like it just has the soul of that, going on an adventure journey, and one of the better, more robust and more well-realized storytelling, or just stories in general. I just can't get over how much I feel like this is one cohesive whole experience, where it's you're on the world tree, and you want, the story feels like it's not super complicated, like you said, but it feels like there's weight to it, and I care about it. I'm interested a little bit in the story, and it's one of those games, maybe one of the most that we've played, that is making me feel like I feel with a modern game that I've chosen to play outside of this podcast that I just get really into. It's if I pick up The Witcher and I get really into The Witcher, and now every day I'm excited to play a little more of that. That's how I feel with this. Like I said, I didn't beat it. I got moderately close. I'm excited to pick it back up again and keep playing. So if I'm not telegraphing this enough, I'm definitely going to vote this essential. And it could be recency bias. So I won't make this statement fully, but like I'll be interested to see after some time goes by exactly where I want to place this on my personal like favorite games of 1989 or favorite games of the NES so far. So yeah, I'm definitely voting for this to be an essential game.
All right, and as you guys know, that's 2 votes for the Essential Games list, so it is automatically on the Essential Games list. It's our newest game on the Essential Games list, and I can't do anything about it, but I still get to vote, and so I will vote right now. As you may have, some of you might have even counted, I have said Zelda 2's name a lot on this podcast, but I've mentioned some other games as well. But, none of these games can be compared to each other because they are all offering something different. My point for bringing up Zelda 2 is because I feel like more than ever, the heat on, Zelda 2 not being an essential game is pretty high. And so when I'm looking at a game like Faxanadu here that, finds some similar things, I found that almost every complaint for things I had in Zelda 2 was answered by a game like Faxanadu here. And what I mean by that is this game is still not like a perfect game by any means, and it doesn't offer the same experience that Zelda 2 does, but I find very little to complain about the actual, story, gameplay, dungeon, progression aspects of this game. There are things that I personally don't like about them, or things that I was like, oh, well, that's a little tedious. I definitely can see that with the combat, since it is just the same kind of fights over and over again. I think they did a good job of doing what they could, right? They weren't going to completely change the combat system on its face, but because it's just something that happens so often, it is what it is at this point. Overall, though, this game for me not only exceeded my expectations, but because of how many people were making comparisons to Zelda 2 leading up to this episode, I went in with that mindset of like, all right, well, if Zelda 2 doesn't make the Essential Games list, why does Faxanadu if I'm going to vote for it? And I can confidently say that I don't even need to defend Faxanadu against Zelda 2 or against any other game on the Essential Games list because it kind of just stands on its own. Like Sean and Joe were saying, this is really a game that doesn't need to be compared to others because it's just a good, tight experience that isn't necessarily NES hard, but still feels like you're making progress and being part of a larger world, stuff that we're just not used to seeing as fully on the NES. So I really liked Faxanadu, and I agree with Joe. This is a game that I was excited to be playing, and I probably will be excited to continue playing it as I get closer to the end of my journey.
So Faxanadu
that's the episode.
Yeah.
Faxanadu.
Faxanadu.
If anything, that's what we learned. It's that everybody is wrong, and we were right last week. We already made up our minds last week about the title of the game, not the essential games.
Yeah.
That is decided by a committee.
I'm a Faxanadu.
Ooh, I like that. Okay, Joe, are you a Faxanadu or a Faxanadu?
You know what? I have something to say, but it won't. I don't believe it. It'll only give you guys ammo, but I'll say it anyways. I was going to say, Faxanadu what Zelda does. But it's not true. I just wanted to say it because I thought it was good.
We're just making enemies now.
Yeah, we really are. But you know what? If anything, we turned Joe a little bit. Joe is one of the enemies.
No.
Okay,
I still love Zelda.
Next week, we have Flying Dragon for you, which I imagine is going to be just a little different than Faxanadu. But
how many goddamn dragon games? Like, have you played in a row? Like, if this is a part of the Dragon Slayer saga, and we just played Dragon Quest, and there was another dragon, Flying Dragon.
Yeah.
What is this, Mike? What are you doing to us?
You'll hate Dragon versus Jordan 1-on-1, which is the following game that we'll be playing the week after that. It's Michael Jordan versus a gigantic dragon with both hands and feet. That's important.
That reference came while we weren't recording, by the way, so the listeners don't know why we keep mentioning dragons' hands and feet.
Well, they have no idea why this is the first time we've ever mentioned hands and feet to them, Joe.
That.
No, we did it. We did it on. You said it also on the Flying Dragon episode,
right? Which is next week.
Oh, uh-oh. Are we going to look behind the curtain here?
No. That's absolutely true. It'll happen next week, folks. If you thought you heard anything about dragons yet, do not worry, because the first time you will hear about Flying Dragon, the Secret Scroll, will be next Friday. But
yeah, for some context, I experience time in the opposite direction as Mike and Sean experience it.
You experience it in your Benjamin Button of this podcast.
Yeah.
Anyway, the point I was trying to make is that every episode, every Friday, it happens. If you want older episodes, they're all available to you. I finally fixed this annoying glitch where 10-Yard Fight wasn't positioned as the first ever
good
episode.
job.
So I finally fixed that. Thank you, everybody. We can fix stuff like that because I'm able to dedicate more time to this show thanks to our patrons who support us at patreon.com/nostalgia. They help us keep the website running. They're awesome people who just motivate me on a daily basis. I read their names every morning as a morning mantra, and then I say, let's go out there and get that bread.